So our next guest, we've got a real treat for you next. Our next guest is all the way from Perth. What up? Who's here from Perth? Yeah, there's three of us. We are here. Perth is in the house. Andy. So Andy, really rich, interesting history. Ran a briefly lived but very well received conference a few years ago called Playgrounds. Since then, he's traveled around the world, worked at a whole bunch of really interesting, kind of smallish startups. I've got some names here. He worked for Meet. Sorry, Meta. What is that? Twitter. I don't think that's real. That's a weird name. But is now back on our shores and ready to talk to us about life at BigTechCo. So please join me in welcoming Andy today.
It's very lopsided. Okay. So hey, my name's Andy Hope. Thanks for the introduction. Today's talk is about my life working at Big Tech. So mainly, yeah, I'll tell you short about that later. Okay, so this talk is going to go over quite a few topics. It's going to be pretty meaty. So I'll talk a bit about myself, interview process, compensation, moving to the US, onboarding, and then what your day-to-day life is like going to be when you're writing code at these places, the different types of archetypes here, as well as scaling a bunch of things, as well as how these things and these companies can also limit you, politics and people, as well as perks, and then I'll finish off with a little conclusion. So, about me, this is a very old avatar, I need to change it, but I've been working in iOS and Apple platforms for roughly about 13 years, starting off with Objective-C, manual memory management, terrible times. Obviously moving to Swift, and then during my time at Meta, learning a lot of Python. So previously, as I said, I've been working at Meta for 4.5 years in the US, so both Silicon Valley as well as New York. And then, excuse me, I left Meta to work at Twitter remotely in Australia for at least about a year before a particular billionaire bought it on a meme. And then currently, I'm representing ANZX, working from Perth, Western Australia. So we'll start with the interview process, right? So this is actually where I did my interview, or how I did my interview. My nephew's cottage room, as you can see all the clothing or the laundry there. So typically you do a first round with a recruiter. This recruiter will ask you like, what's your thing? Like, what do you want out of your life or your career or whatnot? If you're eligible to work in the US, as well as like, they might finish off with a few questions like typical iOS questions like explain a retain cycle or whatnot. So if you do answer those questions and then you do meet that criteria, you'll move on to a second round with another engineer. This is what you call like a pre-screen. The engineer will ask you in between 2 and 3 questions, most likely, and you have to answer these within about 45 minutes. The engineer will then write some feedback, and then if everything's okay, typically you go on to the third round, which is what we would call the onsite. Since COVID, we don't really have onsites, but this is what happens, right? So it's usually at least 4 rounds. Some companies are a little bit different. The coding is the main ones, because we're engineers, we need to know how to code. So typically you do a bunch of algorithms. These will be in whiteboard if you're in person, or CoderPad if you're doing these remotely. I've interviewed at some companies like Airbnb and Square. They do a lot of paired programming. Some people prefer this as opposed to whiteboards, but essentially you're doing algorithms. Meta for a while trialed take-home assignments, but I think they ditched it because eventually you're going to have to do it on-site anyway. One thing to note about these coding questions is you really need to understand your big O notation. So that's time complexity as well as space complexity. Another one is the architecture. So pretty much you'll be asked to design a system or a feature. So let's say you're interviewing with Instagram, right? Like design us the GIF emoji, the GIF keyboard, or design us the story the story timeline. And these questions are really trying to assess how well you know systems, right? So you can go anywhere from like, oh, I'll use a collection view instead of a table view, or I think we should use GraphQL instead of RESTful APIs, and then really test your breadth of knowledge of how these systems all work together. One of the other ones is the behavioral. So how well you work with other people, how you resolve conflicts, as well as how you make your decisions. One of the best behavioral interviews I got was at Airbnb. The chef interviewed me and like, what would be your favorite Airbnb? I'm like, a little like, ramen shack on the middle of a mountain. That'd be pretty sweet. And then, I don't know, it's just really, really good. But basically, this interview is trying to assess how well you deal with situations which you cannot control. Like I said, some companies may double up or add variations. Like Airbnb, they really love their culture, so I did 2 behavioral or 3 behaviorals. A 4th round can sometimes happen, right? So this typically happens when during your coding interview or one of your interviews, there was not enough signal based on your performance, or let's say during your coding interview, 2 engineers had very different feedback on your performance. So if they cannot calibrate between themselves, then they'll say, hey, let's bring on Andy again, and we'll do another one, sort of clear up any sort of ambiguity in this interview. As well as, you might also get 3 coding interviews because someone's in training. So typically that's straightforward. Going into compensation, which is a big one, working in these tech companies, you get your basic salary, like we all have today. You have 2 types of bonuses, your sign-on bonus as well as your annual or performance bonus. And then your RSUs, your reserve stock units. Typically you have an initial grant, assuming this company is like publicly traded, and then you have these things called refreshers. So let's talk about these grants quickly, right? So your initial grant, usually these grants over 4 years, and they vest every 3 months. So let's say you're given $160,000 worth of stock. Every 3 months, you get 16 grants or 16 vests, and you get an extra $10,000 each 3 months. And then you get your performance RSUs, and then that would vest over 4 years as well, and they compound on your initial grant. So your first year you make $10,000 every 3 months, and the second year you might make 15, your third year you might make 20, something like that. So enough about money, so let's move to the US. So typically companies will give you like a stipend, organize everything for you. Facebook is really good because they said, call this number and organize it, and these people just come and pack up your entire house and then move everything you want to the US. Finding accommodation is also pretty hard because you have no social security number, you have no referrals, you have no history in the US. Typically you have like at least a 6-week corporate housing, and during those 6 weeks you should be able to get like your social security number, your driver's license, as well as building a credit score, because Americans love credit cards. It's weird. Some other weird things is food portions are massive, and the food is free. So when I was in the US, when I was working at Meta, there's a thing called the Facebook 15. So you put on 15 pounds, and then I see free food, I just want to eat it. So then I was bragging to my sister when I went home for Christmas, like, yeah, Facebook gives us 3 meals a day. She's like, yeah, we see that. I was like, oh, fair enough. One thing that's going to resonate with this crowd is the coffee is typically terrible. So one thing, especially in Melbourne, right, you can go any random cafe and find pretty decent coffee. You can go the same thing in America, and you're pretty much going to end up with a terrible, terrible, terrible coffee. And it's something I found very disgusting. As well as the Australians and Kiwis are universally loved. We just open our mouths and people think Steve Irwin or, I don't know, who's famous in New Zealand? Lord? Okay, so that's the stuff. And then we got the onboarding, right? So you typically have your orientation days. Some of your high-level executives might give a talk, typically not the CEO. Then you got your corporate training, right? So workplace etiquette. These are basic stuff you sort of have to do corporate training for when you work at a big company anyways. Like at ANZX, obviously corporate training, because we work in a bank, and these things need to be quite rigorous to make sure everyone's on board. You have your internal classes, like your general tech stacks, like, hey, here's how we store data in databases, here are the different types of databases we use, here's the source control we use, here's how we submit stuff, and then you have your domain knowledge, which is like, here's how to write iOS apps at Facebook or Twitter. Because it's a lot of the time it's actually quite different to what you would experience in the real world. So, day-to-day life, right? I like this picture because it kind of starts out like that when you first start at these big companies, like, I know nothing. But, so once a day you pull your code. Code moves very fast, or the repo moves very fast. Like there's code being committed to it every minute, right? So you pull it in once a day, you build your cache, and then you do whatever you got to do, right? You wouldn't pull more than once a day because at the same time, this cache is only valid as long as you keep that, as long as you pull in your code. The second you pull in code again, most of the cache invalidates. When you're modifying your code, this is one interesting thing, right? So at Facebook at least, you have to focus, this thing called focusing, right? So how many frameworks do you think Facebook has on their main Blue app? Say what? Yeah, so let's think tens of thousands. So you can't really just pull in tens of thousands of modules. You need to sort of like, all right, I need to do my work or do my task, I need to work in these modules. Then you specify these modules in the command line, and then it pulls in them in, the interface as well as the implementation. And all the other thousands, it just pulls in the interface. Similar to what Swift Package Manager does. And this actually improves build times, right? Because if you tried pulling in every single piece of code, the build time would take maybe like 5 hours. Doesn't matter on your M1, I had a Mac Pro, everything's slow. Testing code, once again, long build times, as well as like sometimes the debugger breaks, and it's up to the DevX team to sort of figure it out. So, but on top of that, we also have a bunch of CI tests that do a lot of unit tests for us on the CI. Landing code is just as difficult. We have to review code. At Twitter, 2 people would have to stamp a PR. At Facebook, anyone can stamp a PR, which is why some things happen that shouldn't. As well as the weirdest things, like just because it builds on your machine at Meta and Twitter doesn't mean it's going to build in CI. So there's been like a lot of infrastructure work to try to make these builds match as well. But at the same time, you can't really get it completely 100%. And because once again, you get a lot of merge conflicts, and then it's up to you to sort of pull in the code, ruin your cache, or you might have to several different checkouts, so you might have to build it on the server or modify it on the server, then resubmit it. It's crazy. All right, so now we're going into the engineering archetypes. So there's 2 types of archetypes of engineer. The first is a product engineer. These people usually work in a top-down as well as a bottom-up decision-making. So top-down would be like Adam Mosseri, the CEO of Instagram, saying, hey, we're going to focus on video. Then it's up to the engineers as well as the teams to sort of like, all right, how are we going to make video a priority for us? Like, let's build this piece of infrastructure, or let's build this and sort of make video more prominent. Product engineer will typically work with EMs, product managers, data scientists, designers, and other engineers, and then they ship features based on data. So let's say there's some analytics saying, if we do X, then we're going to improve engagement by 0.5%, which is big. And during these analytics, you'll monitor the metrics and make tweaks accordingly. Success is typically based on how well it's received by the users, as well as there are other non-tangible things. Like when I worked on Novi, we didn't ship because Congress didn't like us. So my success was based on how well I enabled my other engineers to sort of do their work as a product engineer, which I found pretty interesting. In my opinion, the more fun one is the infrastructure engineer. So this is completely bottom-up decision-making. As our infrastructure engineer, we have a team, and that team has a very ambiguous purview. Like, hey, our team is to make UI better for the company. What does that mean? It means whatever we want it to mean. It means we can say, hey, I think I'm going to do asset generation or use a SwiftGen like Objective-C, and that's going to make every other engineer's life better at the company better. So we work on tools related to other teams' domain, as well as we help teams get to where they need to go without any sort of guidance from leadership. Once again, clients are engineers, and it's way more fun to be an infrastructure engineer, in my opinion. There are a few different archetypes of levels. So typically, a junior engineer is someone who's fresh out of college or maybe 1 or 2 years in the industry. A mid-level, and also a junior engineer needs a lot of guidance from their manager saying, hey, this is our team, this is what our team works on, you should go work on this project, and then a little bit of hand-holding, right? The mid-level is very much similar to a junior, but they're a little bit more autonomous. They still need a lot of guidance, but at the same time, you can let them run for a little bit, and then they'll sort of ask for help when they need it. A senior engineer is someone who should be completely autonomous. So the EM, the engineering manager just says, what are you working on? And then you tell them, and is this a good idea or not a good idea? And they say, yes, it is. No, it's not. A staff engineer is a very big jump from a senior engineer. A staff engineer is pretty much in charge of the team, as well as the nearby org, right? So interesting fact about leveling at these companies is a staff engineer is actually on par with an engineering manager. So when you have a staff engineer and an engineering manager on the same team, they actually work together. So the EM doesn't tell the staff what to do, and the staff doesn't tell the EM what to do unless they collaborate. And it's this kind of thing like, hey, the EM will take care of the career trajectory, and then the staff will sort of take care of the technicality of it. A senior staff, much more responsibility. You're taking care of the org as well as maybe even the company. And a principal engineer is someone you're making industry-wide changes. Let's say John Carmack. he works on VR, like that's a big industry-wide change. Same as GraphQL, like these are principal engineers, right? The entire ecosystem of engineering relies on these people, or sort of builds on the backs of these people. So if we get into the scaling, so I'm really rushing through this, like a very big meaty talk. So we get into the scaling, right? So a lot of the scaling the code is really trying to optimize the compiler. Some things that Meta does is they remove dead code automatically. So they use the AST to say like, hey, this API is never called or never referenced anywhere inside the app, so let's just not compile it. Let's just leave it out. Or let's just put in an empty implementation. One thing I found pretty crazy was C functions are prolific everywhere inside the app. So what they found out is Obj-C message send. So that is when you have the square brackets in Objective-C. Every time you use those square brackets, it creates 10 bytes of metadata. 10 bytes of metadata, no one cares about that, right? But when you're talking about thousands of frameworks, those 10 bytes really add up. Once again, you're going to be optimizing the code, do a bunch of AST analysis. We had linters as well as code mod tools, which use the C AST, and that was pretty nuts in my opinion, as well as removing dead code, as well as dead assets, which is what I worked on. Once again, reducing the binary size is a big thing. So when I joined the company, I think the Wi-Fi limit was 100 megabytes or maybe 150, and the Facebook app was over. So they did some they looked at the analytics, and then they realized that each megabyte over the Wi-Fi limit, or each megabyte, caused a regression in upload or update rates by 100,000 people. So 1 megabyte, no one cares, right? People bring in frameworks more than 1 megabyte, but 100,000 people, is it worth sacrificing? Not really. So then we go into improving the developer experience. I worked a bit on that. So one thing you sort of learn to realize is that the standard Apple tools don't really scale to Facebook or Google's requirements, which is fine, because we are the minority inside the development community, right? Apple really cares more about the individual developer, the small teams or the medium-sized teams, but they don't really care about, it's not really part of their priority to sort of take care of teams that have 1,000 people who can also hire their own infrastructure engineers. Also lagging support for Swift, so Facebook uses the Buck build system. Typically that was built for Objective-C and Java, and then it was kind of brought over, and we tried adding support to Swift. It has a lot of things, Swift still has a lot of things to sort of work on, but it's getting there, as well as Facebook is actually trying to adopt it. It's on scale now. So now we're going to try to scale yourself, right? So let's say you work on an infrastructure team, you built something really, really great. Just because you built something great doesn't mean people will use it. You really have to promote your work, right? Which is where a lot of this stuff comes from. It's like, hey, I built X, and you should use it because of your build times will be faster, or you have more type-safe symbols, or something like that, right? And you'll scale yourself based upon how many people will adopt whatever you do, or take on board whatever you do. And one way to sort of scale a career is you need to own more things. So more ownership obviously means more problems. When I first joined the team, my first project was the bottom sheets. Every time you press the ellipses on the Facebook newsfeed, that bottom sheet came up. There were 5 at the company. I brought them all under one roof, and then I became the bottom sheet guy. And everyone reached out to me with the bottom sheets, and I'm like, yes, or can we add navigation to the bottom sheets? Can we add this to the bottom sheets? Yes, no, yes, no. And that created a lot of problems for me, because then a lot of my day was answering bottom sheet questions. Obviously you have to document, but a lot of people don't document if they're not really forced to. One of the other things is give internal talks. So these companies host internal conferences and internal summits. Give a talk about whatever you're working on, and then eventually when you move a team, you pass ownership to someone else. Say, you're the bottom sheet guy now, have fun. That was the best day of my life. So scaling your career, right? So EMs are a lot different to my experience. When I was working in Melbourne previously, an EM was kind of more of a PM, hey, we should work on this, you should work on this. Where at these companies, they're more like shepherds for your career, which I found really, really cool. They don't really tell you what you need to be doing, but it's hey, where do you want to go? Are you happy at your level? Do you want to be promoted? And then, they help you with performance reviews, which is really, really good. And then you also have to cover all axes. In Meta, we have 4 axes. So direction is kind of saying, what projects do we need to solve, right? To progress our team or our org or whatever, right? And then from that, you have the project impact, where it's like, okay, you solved this problem, but how well did you solve it? Are people adopting it? Is it making meaningful difference, right? Impact is like the biggest word at Facebook. Engineering excellence is one where it's like, cool, you have a lot of impact, but did you do a good job doing it? Did you write good code? Did you have a lot of tests? Did you document it? Did you give talks about it? And then the final one, which isn't as high priority as the previous three, is the people axis, where it's like, all right, well, how did you coach the juniors? Did you interview enough people, or did you give enough external talks, right? And how well did you manage your relationship with other people inside and outside the company? Excuse me. So, getting promoted, you have to plan accordingly. One thing I really appreciated is that being promoted is based on performance, not so much potential. So what this means is like, hey, Andy's doing a really good job. I think he'd be good as an EM or as a TL or a tech lead, sorry. And I'm sure everyone knows someone who's like being put in that role and it's like, yeah, I'm actually not good at this. And then you kind of like burn out and then leave the company or whatever. So to get promoted at these companies, you need to perform at the level you're going to, the next level, for a period amount of time, right? So from junior to senior, at least a full half of promoting, working at that level. And then from staff engineer, like at least like 9 months, 6 to 12 months, but usually around the 9-month mark. Sadly, there's no such thing as down leveling. So once you reach a certain level, you can't go back. I've heard of some rumors of someone being down level, but it's a myth. And as well as, compensation, it lags. So let's say you get promoted at the start of the year, you won't see that full compensation bump until maybe like 4 or 5 months in. But those bumps are big. So these are pretty cool points and all, but one thing I've found, this is what I've discovered coming back to working in Australia and ANZX, is like, because I've worked on such ad hoc systems at Facebook and Twitter, I don't know how the real world works. Like, I'm like, how do I do a PR in GitHub? Or like, because, when I got acquired, or when I joined Facebook, GitHub just got acquired by Microsoft, and it's changed everything. It's great. But I'm like, how do you stack a PR? And how do I rebase? Or like, not even rebase, sorry, but like, if I have a commit like down in the stack, then can I change it? Or do I need to unstack everything? Like, I'm still learning these things. But, I understand the concept, which is great, but at the same time, there is a bit of a ramp up working in these, like, I guess you'd say like real world companies, right? There are non-transferable skills, like, yeah, I'm really good at focusing, or I really understand how the focus compiler works, but it means nothing. Like, I tell people that, it's like, they don't care. And as well as, less time for external activities. So, I held a conference. I used to give a lot of tech talks and keep a really good blog, and you join these companies and it really just consumes you. Like, you're trying to get promoted to the next level, and that takes time, and yeah, it can be tough, but after a while you get comfortable with being in uncomfortable environments, and it kind of pays off. So, how are we doing with the time? Okay. Politics and people is one of the weird things at the company, right? Because when you work at these teams, or this company is so big, like, you have to learn how to deal with people. Just because you do something and that is technically the right thing to do, doesn't mean your peers are going to believe that. You need to sort of like understand how to have these conversations and how to get them on board of what you're trying to do. And it happens at all levels of the company. Your team, like trying to convince the team to build X feature instead of Y. The org, trying to get the org to do something for your team because it'll be beneficial to the other teams, and as well as company. I don't have much level of that company, but I'm sure there's politics at this leadership. Some of the perks, obviously there's free food and swag, 3 meals a day, flights and accommodation. Like, I gave a tech talk here, I think 2019, and Facebook flew me out business class and paid for everything. That was great. I've worked at several offices around the world, so Berlin, Tel Aviv, LA, whatever. There is a little prestige for the CV. Recruiters do love the fact that, hey, you worked at Facebook, you worked at Twitter. Compensation's great. Learning new cultures, like when you work at these satellite cities such as New York and San Francisco, like you meet people from all over the world, and that's really great. Like, I learned a lot about one of my managers was Indian, so I learned a lot about Indian culture. One of my managers was Chinese, learned a lot about Chinese culture, and then also just having lunch with my teammates every day. It's really, really great to sort of have that sort of connect with people. And, working with some of the brightest minds in the industry is like such a big bonus, because when I was doing Swift support for the Buck system, debugger wouldn't work, right? Or syntax highlighting wasn't working. So then my manager said, hey, reach out to this person. And turns out this person actually created LLDB. So when you type PO in the console, it's like, that's his thing. And I'm like, hey man, like, why doesn't this work? And he just dumps everything on me. It's like a 15-minute rant. And I'm just smiling, like, oh yeah, cool, cool. And I go lie down for 15 minutes. I'm like, I have no idea what this guy said, but I'll try and make sense of it all. But yeah, and this photo, this is my bedroom in New York. Like, I come from a bogan place in Perth, and I would never have pictured myself living like with this view. Every day you wake up and you pinch yourself like, man, I did good. So, would I recommend it? Hell yeah, it's great. But if you're really interested, start preparing now. Do interview practices, do algorithms, do what you got to do, right? I left Melbourne. I wrote on a whiteboard every day for 6 weeks, studied all these sorts of algorithms, and then I did a whole bunch of interviews. I did, 6 interviews. I have a blog up on Medium. You can search it. It will give you a head start on life. Once I said, well, I don't come from much, but working at these companies has kind of put me in a financial position where I can sort of take care of my family, take care of myself, and everything's good. The one thing I didn't realize I would have is like an appreciation for Australia and New Zealand on a much deeper level. Like I said, I grew up nowhere special, but after you spend so much time there and you really get into the culture and the society, it's like, man, Australia's got it really good. Like, we are really, really lucky to sort of like have the support network we need. The government, whatever you want to say about it, but still it's much better than theirs. So yeah, and I think that's it. So thank you for listening to my talk.
Thanks, Andy. That was terrific. I think this is one of the easiest talks to come up with some really good, interesting questions, because there's a whole wide range of stuff there that I'm sure interested different people in different ways. So who'd like to start us off? Who's got a question? Yeah, great.
Andy, thanks for the talk. Why did you come back?
So COVID, really. I loved it for the first 2 years while I was over there. Then COVID happened. And then it's weird, I was locked out of Australia for 2 years. It's like I couldn't go back to Perth. At least I was locked out of WA for 2 years. And it was just like, man, I really miss my family. If it wasn't for COVID, I might still be there, but I'm getting old now, so family is a much bigger priority in my life than living and partying in New York. Yeah.
It was really weird at the time. Like Perth, we were like the freest people in the world.
Yeah.
Inside our boundaries.
Yeah.
It was
like a one-way flight from New York to Perth was $20,000 US.
Yeah.
So I was like, yeah, I can't afford that.
So you've said you would recommend it, but I think in the current climate, seeing a certain billionaire take over, and for one company, and then for Meta as well, doing layoffs.
Yeah.
Do you think that changes your opinion? Being at a big company now, it might be more obvious that you're just another cog in a machine rather than that sort of thing.
Being a cog in the machine allows you to sort of go deep on a specific subject, right? Like, if someone said to me, like, hey, you're going to work 3 months on trying to figure out why Swift syntax highlighting or the debugger isn't working for Swift, you can't do that in any other company. Like, I'm just this tiny cog, but I get to go really, really deep and have this, once again, this like really nuanced piece of skill set. But markets go up and down. It's crazy right now. I'm sure once interest rates go down, people start hiring again. There'll be a big boom. But yeah, I'd still recommend it.
So you were known as the bottom shit guy at the time when you were working in Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know, were you able to actually share that ownership to some other people? Because you were being approached all the time for, the bottom shit feature. Were you able to actually share the knowledge to some other people? And then if anyone asks you to help them with the bottom shit, you can tell them, oh, actually, I can refer you to Mr. X because I transferred the knowledge to that person.
Yeah, I changed teams to get away from that one. Yeah, like you can't really, at least in my situation, I couldn't really say to the team like, hey, let's all take care of bottom sheet because it doesn't really make sense for other teams to sort of like use their time and they're only having like such surface level implementation, right? Like I brought in all these bottom sheets to one, I know it in and out, and they got their own projects to do and all that kind of stuff. So it's really, yeah, sometimes you have to change teams.
Did you ever manage to find top sheet guy?
Not yet. Not yet. Yeah.
How big did you find the teams to be at Facebook? Like, was there like a universal team size that they recommended to try and constrain people to, or?
Yeah. Usually a team would be, at least on the infrastructure, maybe like four engineers, at least on infrastructure. Product, you wouldn't really have a designer would jump between teams on product, but you'd have maybe like 2 iOS and then 2 Android on product and all that kind of stuff. At one point, my manager was getting promoted, so we had 20 people in my team at one point. They just had to find someone to take on, a subsect of the team. Yeah, but usually 4 to 6 people. It's pretty good.
So did you, I don't know, meet many people that worked at different companies in the US, and like how from smaller companies versus bigger companies, how would you say like the work-life balance sort of worked out?
Yeah. So funny thing is, like, when you're in Silicon Valley, you're like, I just want to be around tech. I just go to these parties and like, oh my God, like you work at Uber, you got acquired by Google. That's so great. And after a year, I was like, I can't stand tech people. I was like, it's just the same conversation over and over again. Like, I got acquired. We overlapped. I'm like, cool, man. So yeah, there's that. The smaller companies, Twitter US had like unlimited PTO, or unlimited annual leave, which is kind of sketchy because you don't get paid out of annual leave, and typically people feel guilty by taking like 2 to 3 weeks, 4 weeks annual leave. But then the juniors would be like, I'm taking 6 weeks to go to Cabo. So yeah, the work-life balance. Some people at Twitter really liked Twitter. I have different opinions though. But I think Gio.
They are.
Yeah, get him some beers into me and then we'll do.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Great. So Facebook became infamous for the move fast and break things.
Yeah.
But actually, the vision changed after a while to move fast on stable infrastructure.
Yeah.
Have you got some stories about that?
Yeah, so I mentioned like it only takes one person to stamp a pull request, or a diff is what we call them. And I can see how the whole Cambridge Analytica thing came about, like move fast, and people like sometimes don't really pay much attention to these things. Like, oh, they look at it at a surface level and then they'd stamp it and things would happen, right? There's an internal group, what is it called, Sev reviews? Yeah, so people like stamp a diff, and then they land it, and they would cause a sev, like a side event, right? Yeah, and that's like, all hands on deck, we need to solve this thing, right? And then you look at the reviews, it's like, oh, this does this, and then people put GIFs up, it's like, you idiots, like, you should have really looked at this. So it does happen, and then ever since that, the FTC did an order, I think, and then we had to sort of start specifying, like, does this touch user data, does this do this, and does this do that, right? So I can see how it happened, and but I think the company did a lot of course correcting when it really came down to it. But that doesn't excuse it that it happened to begin with.
Probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions if we still have some.
I was going to ask, what's the craziest tech event that you were at when you worked at Facebook and Twitter?
Oh, the golden days before COVID, we have the Facebook holiday party, and like they rent out something like what's a big arena, right? For 2 nights, 40,000 people would come on board, and they have their own festival party thing. I got really drunk. I got a really funny story, but it's probably not the best place to talk about it. But yeah, like their internal events can be pretty wild, like just on scale, Yeah.
Line up to talk to Andy at afternoon tea to get that story. 1 more question? No, we're good? All right, a little bit of a break. Back here in 5 minutes. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks so much.